Most chaos doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with something ordinary. A quiet kitchen. A silver tray. A woman adjusting champagne glasses, like it's just another Thursday evening. Elena didn't wake up that morning, expecting her world to split into before and after. She woke up because the sunlight slipped past the curtains and landed gently across her bedroom wall. She woke up because habit is stronger than heartbreak. She woke up because grief, at first, doesn't feel real. Have you ever had a day like that? A day where nothing looks different, but everything feels unfamiliar. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time that morning, staring at the floor. The house was silent, too silent for a place that usually hummed with staff footsteps and early phone calls. Even the air felt slower. 12 hours earlier, she had stood beside her mother's casket. Now she was thinking about whether the crystal glasses were polished properly. That's how chaos sneaks in. Not with thunder, but with normalcy. And if you've ever been expected to function when your heart felt heavy, then you already understand what this story is about. Welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you believe love is more than grand gestures, if you believe it's about learning, unlearning, and sometimes growing through the uncomfortable parts, then you're in the right place. And before we go any further, subscribe, because stories like this, they don't just entertain, they remind us who we are when life gets difficult. Now let me take you back into that kitchen. Elena stood at the marble counter, holding a silver tray she didn't remember picking up. Her black dress still carried the faint scent of funeral lilies. Her heels felt heavier than usual, like gravity had decided to press a little harder today. The refrigerator hummed. Ice clinked against crystal. Outside, faint laughter drifted in from the backyard. Guests were arriving for a promotion party. Her husband's promotion party. She placed the first glass down carefully. Then the second, then the third. Her hands were steady. That the strange part. Inside, she felt worn, not shattered, not screaming, just tired, the kind of tired sleep doesn't fix. She wasn't falling apart. She was functioning, and sometimes functioning is the most exhausting thing a person can do. From the hallway, she heard his voice. Make sure the press stays outside the east gate, Marcus said calmly, and no personal questions tonight. He always sounded like that. Controlled, measured, efficient. Marcus Hale, newly promoted CEO, man of immaculate timing and flawless composure. He had built his life on discipline, on precision, on forward movement. And today, forward movement meant celebration. Elena pressed her palms lightly against the counter. Her chest tightened, not with rage, not even with resentment. It was something more subtle, a dull ache that had lived quietly in her marriage for years. It only grew louder when she was vulnerable. 2 hours earlier, Marcus had stood in their bedroom doorway and said, "The party can't be postponed. It's important. I need you there, hosting." He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't dismissed her grief. He had simply prioritized. And that was somehow harder to argue with. Have you ever been in a relationship where the other person isn't cruel, but still misses what you need? That space between intention and impact. That's where most marriages struggle. Elena picked up another glass. She remembered her mother's hands. Soft, warm, always lingering a second longer than necessary. Her mother had believed in emotional pauses, in sitting still with pain, in not rushing through hard days. Marcus believed in momentum. To him, stopping meant sinking. To her, stopping meant healing. Footsteps approached behind her. "You're still in the kitchen?" he asked. She didn't turn right away. She focused on her reflection in the glass cabinet. Swollen eyes carefully hidden under makeup. Posture straightened by sheer will. I needed a minute, she said softly. There was a pause. Marcus wasn't good with pauses. He filled them with solutions. The guests will start coming through here soon, he replied. It would look better if you were in the main hall. Look better, not feel better. Not are you okay. Just look better. She turned slowly. He stood exactly the way he always did. Suit tailored perfectly, shoulders square, expression unreadable. There were no cracks in him, no visible signs that he, too, had attended a funeral that morning. My mom died yesterday, she said, not accusing, just stating reality out loud. His jaw tightened slightly. I know. Do you? Another pause. He inhaled carefully, as if selecting the most logical response from a mental spreadsheet. Elena, this promotion was finalized months ago. The board, the investors, they're expecting this event. Canceling now would create unnecessary speculation. There it was again. Not heartlessness. Structure, control, stability. Marcus had learned early in life that emotions were unpredictable. His father had died when he was 16. The next morning, he went to school. 2 weeks later, he stepped into responsibilities he wasn't ready for. Grief, to him, was something you walked through while working. Stillness felt dangerous, so he avoided it. Always. I'm not asking you to cancel, Elena said quietly. I just didn't expect to serve drinks at your celebration the day after I buried my mother. You're not serving drinks, he corrected gently. You're hosting. You're my wife. There it was. Again. Function. Role. Expectation. Elena felt something twist inside her. Not anger, but conflict. Because she knew he wasn't trying to hurt her. That, the complicated part. He thought keeping her busy would help. He thought productivity softened pain. He thought forward motion prevented collapse. And maybe for him, it did. But love isn't about applying your coping style to someone else. That's one of the hardest lessons in marriage. Marcus studied her face more carefully now. He noticed the faint redness around her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly, despite her effort to stand tall. I thought staying busy would help, he said finally. Elena blinked. That answer didn't feel dismissive. It felt revealing. You thought keeping me occupied would help me grieve, she asked. He hesitated, because, yes, that was exactly what he thought. I don't handle loss by stopping. He, carefully. Stopping makes it worse. She stared at him for the first time that evening. She didn't feel dismissed. She felt misunderstood. And misunderstanding is quieter than cruelty. But it can feel just as lonely. I'm not you, Marcus, she whispered. I know, but he didn't. Not fully. Not yet. Outside, laughter grew louder. Glasses clinked. The party was beginning, whether their emotional alignment was ready or not. Elena picked up the tray again. I'll host, she said. I promised. And sometimes love looks like endurance. But here's the question, and I want you to really think about this. Is endurance the same as connection? Or have we just convinced ourselves it is? If this story already feels familiar to you, if you've ever felt emotionally out of sync with someone you love, take a moment right now and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been misunderstood instead of mistreated? Because there's a difference. And this story lives in that difference. Elena adjusted the tray in her hands. Marcus reached forward suddenly and stopped it. You don't have to carry anything tonight, he said. The words came out awkwardly, not poetic, not dramatic, just intentional. And sometimes growth doesn't start with a grand gesture. It starts with one small correction. But neither of them knew yet that this night, this ordinary, polished, well-planned night, would quietly expose the cracks they had both been avoiding. Not with screaming, not with betrayal, but with something far more difficult: honesty. And this was only the beginning. By the time the first guests stepped into the house, Elena had already perfected her smile. Not a happy smile, not a relaxed one, a functional smile, the kind people wear when they don't have the emotional luxury to fall apart. The chandelier lights reflected softly across the marble floors, and the house, the same house that had felt unbearably quiet that morning, now buzzed with low laughter, polite greetings, and the subtle hum of wealth and expectation. Ordinary to everyone else, heavy to her. That is the thing about emotional pain. The world doesn't pause for it. Events don't reschedule themselves. People don't automatically see what you're carrying inside. The more composed you look, the more people assume you're fine. Elena, you look beautiful, one of the guests said warmly as she entered the main hall. She nodded politely. Thank you. Beautiful. Not grieving, not exhausted, not emotionally drained. Just beautiful. Marcus stood near the center of the room, surrounded by board members and investors, his posture composed, his voice steady, his presence commanding without being loud. He wasn't smiling widely, but there was a quiet pride in his expression, the pride of a man who had spent years building something and had finally reached a milestone. And yet, every few seconds, his eyes flickered across the room, searching, tracking, landing on Elena. Not hovering, not controlling, just watching. It was subtle enough that no one else would notice. Because when you live with someone long enough, you begin to recognize their quiet patterns more than their loud behaviors. A server approached her. Ma'am, should we start circulating the champagne? Elena glanced at the tray in her hands, then at the guests, slowly filling the room. For a brief second, her mind drifted back to the funeral hall. The scent of flowers, the soft murmurs, the weight of final goodbyes. The contrast hit her chest like a quiet wave. Morning, evening, celebration. Human emotions were never meant to switch that quickly. Yes, she said gently. Please start with the east side of the hall. Her voice sounded calm, even to herself, and that her a little. Because sometimes when grief goes quiet, it doesn't mean it's gone. It means it's settling deeper. Marcus finished a conversation and approached her slowly, careful not to draw attention. You don't have to stay in one place, he said in a low voice. You can sit whenever you need to. She looked at him. That was new. Not an order, not an expectation. Adjustment? I'm fine, she replied automatically. And there it was, the most common sentence spoken by emotionally exhausted people. I'm fine. Not because they are, but because explaining feels heavier than enduring. Marcus studied her for a moment longer than usual. You don't have to be, he said quietly. The sentence was simple, but it lingered. Before she could respond, another group of guests approached, congratulating him on his promotion. Conversations resumed. Laughter followed. Cameras flashed discreetly from a distance. Elena stepped slightly aside, allowing him to move back into his professional role. And that's when she noticed something. Every time someone tried to pull her into long conversations, especially the media representatives, Marcus subtly redirected them. Not dramatically, not possessively, strategically. She's had a long day, he told one journalist with calm politeness. Let's keep the focus on the company tonight. Was a small thing, almost invisible, but emotionally significant, because real support isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like quiet protection in crowded rooms. Still, protection didn't erase exhaustion. An hour passed, then another. The conversations blurred together. Compliments, business discussions, social pleasantries, questions about future plans, smiles, nods, controlled breathing. Emotional fatigue has a rhythm. First comes adrenaline, then numbness. Then comes the slow, creeping weight of reality. Elena felt it settling in her shoulders, her chest, her thoughts. She excused herself politely and walked toward the balcony doors, needing air more than conversation. The night outside was calm, cool, honest, like the carefully curated energy inside. She stepped onto the balcony and rested her hands lightly on the railing. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, indifferent to promotions, funerals, and human contradictions. For the first time that evening, she allowed her shoulders to drop, not dramatically, just slightly, and sometimes that slight drop is the first sign of emotional honesty. Have you ever noticed how strong people only relax when they're alone? Not because they're pretending, but because solitude is the only place they don't feel observed. The balcony door opened quietly behind her. She didn't turn immediately. "I wasn't trying to make tonight harder for you," Marcus said. No defensiveness, no corporate tone, just a statement. She exhaled slowly. "I know," and she meant it. That was the complicated truth. He wasn't cruel. He was conditioned. There is a difference, and understanding that difference is one of the most important emotional lessons in any long-term relationship. "You believe staying busy protects people from pain," she continued softly. He leaned slightly against the doorframe. "It protects me from it." Honesty, rare, polished, real. She turned then, looking at him more closely than she had all day. "You went to work the day after your father died," she said quietly. His eyes flickered. Surprised. "Yes? You never really stopped moving after that?" "No." "And you think if you stop?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Everything you've been holding back will catch up to you." Silence filled the space between them. Not tense, not hostile, just heavy with recognition. "That's accurate," he admitted. And just like that, something shifted again. Not resolution, not reconciliation, understanding, educational truth. People don't always hurt others intentionally. Sometimes they project the coping mechanisms that once saved them. Inside, applause suddenly erupted. Someone had begun a congratulatory speech. Marcus glanced toward the hall, then back at her. "You can leave after the board address," he said. No extended hosting, no expectations after that. She raised an eyebrow, faintly. "You're adjusting the plan again." "Yes." "Why?" He paused, then answered with unusual sincerity. "Because I'm realizing grief doesn't operate on schedules." That sentence stayed with her. Deeply, quietly, and for the first time that night, the tightness in her chest eased, not because her pain disappeared, but because he was no longer trying to organize it like a business problem. Progress in relationships is rarely loud. It's subtle, gradual, intentional. And standing there on that balcony, under the quiet night sky, Elena realized something her mother used to say often. Love is not about finding someone who understands you instantly. It's about finding someone willing to learn you slowly. She looked at Marcus again. "You're not good with emotions," she said gently. "I'm not," he agreed without hesitation. "But you're trying." "Yes, and trying," she whispered, almost to herself, "is different from forcing." Inside, the speech reached its peak. Laughter followed. Glasses clinked. Again, the world continued celebrating. But on that balcony, something far more important was happening. Two people, two different coping styles, two imperfect emotional languages, learning, slowly, how not to misinterpret each other's silence. And that night, without dramatic apologies or grand gestures, Marcus did something small but meaningful. When they returned inside, he stayed near her. Not to control, not to supervise, but to quietly ensure no one demanded more from her than she could emotionally give. And Elena noticed, because even in grief, the heart still observes effort. If this story touched your heart even a little, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more emotional, realistic love stories that teach powerful life lessons. Have you ever been in a situation where you were misunderstood instead of mistreated? Where someone loved you, but didn't emotionally understand what you were going through? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And stay with me, because in the next chapter, we uncover how a marriage that looked stable on the outside was quietly built on emotional patterns neither of them fully understood. Before grief exposed the cracks in their marriage, Elena and Marcus had what most people would call a perfect life. Not loud, not dramatic, not chaotic, just stable, and stability to the outside world often looks like happiness. But stability and emotional intimacy are not always the same thing. Their story didn't begin with tension. It began with something much quieter. Safety. Years earlier, Elena had met Marcus Hale at a charity fundraiser in downtown Chicago, a place filled with soft piano music, polite laughter, and conversations that sounded important even when they weren't. She wasn't looking for love that night. She was looking for distraction. Her mother had just started chemotherapy then, and Elena had spent months balancing hospital visits, freelance work, and emotional strength she never officially signed up for. She had learned early how to function under pressure, how to show up, even when life felt uncertain. So when she first saw Marcus, he didn't stand out because he was the richest man in the room. He stood out because he was the calmest. While others networked aggressively and laughed too loudly, Marcus spoke with quiet intention. He listened more than he talked. He didn't rush conversations. He didn't perform charm. He observed. And to a woman whose life felt emotionally unpredictable at the time, that kind of composure felt grounding. Ordinary. Safe. Do you always look like you're analyzing the entire room? She had asked him that night, half amused. His lips curved slightly. Only when I'm trying to understand people before they speak. That sounds exhausting. It's efficient, he replied. That was Marcus. Not cold, not distant, just structured. And structure can be very attractive to someone who is emotionally overwhelmed. Have you ever noticed how we're often drawn to people who represent what we lack internally? Elena lacked emotional stability during that period of her life. Marcus embodied it. Marcus lacked emotional openness. Elena naturally carried it. At the time, it felt like balance. In reality, it was the beginning of a quiet mismatch neither of them fully recognized. Their conversations were easy, in an unexpected way, not deeply emotional, not intensely romantic, just steady, predictable, respectful. He didn't overwhelm her with grand gestures. He didn't demand emotional vulnerability too quickly. He simply showed up consistently. And consistency, especially during difficult seasons of life, can feel like love. 3 months into dating, her mother had a difficult hospital week. Marcus didn't say, "Tell me how you feel." He said, "I've cleared my schedule Thursday. I'll drive you." At the time, that meant everything. He didn't ask emotional questions. He solved practical problems. Educational truth. Some people express care through emotional presence. Others express care through reliability and action. Neither is wrong, but misunderstanding the difference can create emotional gaps later in relationships. Elena remembered sitting in the hospital waiting room back then, exhausted and anxious, when Marcus handed her a cup of coffee without saying a word. "You didn't have to stay," she told him quietly. "I prefer being useful," he replied. Useful, not expressive, not emotionally reassuring. Useful, and she accepted that language of love, because during that phase of her life, usefulness felt comforting. Her friends used to say, "He's so composed, so dependable, so stable," and they weren't wrong. Marcus was dependable. He called when he said he would. He arrived on time. He kept promises. He never played emotional games. But he also rarely spoke about feelings. Not because he didn't have them, because he didn't process them the same way. There is a life lesson hidden in this pattern, one many couples learn too late. Reliability builds trust, but emotional availability builds connection. At first, the absence of emotional depth didn't feel like a problem. It felt peaceful. After a year of dating, when he proposed, it wasn't dramatic. No orchestra, no grand public display, no speech about destiny, just a quiet dinner, a simple ring, and a calm sentence. I believe we would build a stable life together. Stable, not passionate, not overwhelming, not poetic. And, strangely, she said yes, without hesitation, because at that time in her life, stability sounded more valuable than intensity. Her mother even smiled when she met Marcus for the first time. He's quiet, her mother observed gently later that evening. He's reliable, Elena corrected. Her mother nodded slowly. Reliability is a beautiful trait, she said, but make sure he knows how to sit with your emotions too. Elena had laughed softly back then. He does, in his own way, and he did, just not in ways she fully understood yet. Early marriage was smooth, almost too smooth. No explosive arguments, no dramatic conflicts, no emotional chaos. Marcus handled finances with precision. He managed their schedules. He ensured their home ran efficiently. Problems were addressed quickly, logically, and calmly. To the outside world, they were the ideal couple. Successful husband, graceful wife, elegant home, predictable life. But emotional gaps rarely appear as obvious problems in the beginning. They appear as small moments. Moments like when Elena cried quietly after a stressful week, and Marcus responded by suggesting a vacation instead of asking what hurt. Moments like when she wanted to talk about her fears regarding her mother's health, and he responded with medical research and treatment options instead of emotional reassurance. He wasn't dismissing her feelings. He was trying to fix the situation because, in his mind, solving the problem reduced the pain. And that belief had been shaped long before Elena entered his life. You see, when Marcus lost his father at 16, no one sat him down and taught him how to grieve emotionally. Instead, he was told something far more common in high-responsibility families. Stay strong. The family needs you. So he stayed strong. He stayed functional. He stayed productive. And somewhere along the way, he unconsciously learned a dangerous emotional lesson. If you keep moving, pain cannot catch you. That mindset built his empire, but it also quietly shaped his marriage. Back in the present, as Elena stood in the same house years later, now quieter after the promotion party, she began to see those patterns more clearly than ever before. Not with anger, but with awareness, because grief has a way of slowing everything down long enough for truth to surface. And the truth wasn't that Marcus didn't care. The truth was that he had always loved her the only way he knew how, through stability, through provision, through consistency. But now, standing in a season of loss, Elena didn't just need stability. She needed emotional presence. And those two needs, for the first time in their marriage, were no longer aligned. She sat on the edge of the bed later that night, heels finally off, the silence of the room settling around her like a quiet mirror. Marcus entered a few minutes later, loosening his tie slightly, a rare sign of physical fatigue. The board was pleased, he said calmly. She nodded faintly. I'm glad. A pause followed, not hostile, not tense, just emotionally unfinished. And that unfinished silence carried a lesson many marriages face at some point. You can live peacefully with someone for years and still not fully understand how they experience pain. Elena looked down at her hands. Then, softly, she asked the question she hadn't asked in years. Marcus, when your father died, did anyone ever ask how you felt? He stopped mid-motion, and for the first time that night, he didn't respond immediately, because some questions don't challenge logic. They challenge memory. And memory, when tied to suppressed grief, is never simple. Marcus didn't answer her question right away, not because he didn't hear it, but because it was the kind of question that didn't belong in boardrooms, strategy meetings, or structured conversations. It belonged somewhere quieter, somewhere unmeasured. Did anyone ever ask how you felt? She had said. He stood still for a moment, one hand resting lightly against the back of the chair, his tie loosened just enough to signal fatigue, not vulnerability. No, he said, finally. The word wasn't defensive. It was factual. Elena watched him carefully, noticing the way his posture remained composed, even as the silence stretched between them. That was Marcus' pattern. Even when discussing something deeply personal, his body stayed disciplined, almost as if emotional discomfort had been trained out of him over the years. They asked if I was ready, he continued calmly. They asked if I could handle responsibilities. They asked if I would step into my father's role. He paused. No one asked how I felt. And just like that, the past quietly explained the present. Educational truth. People who grow up being praised for strength often learn to suppress vulnerability, not because they lack emotions, but because they were never given permission to express them. Elena exhaled slowly. That must have been lonely, she said. Marcus frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in unfamiliarity with the word itself. I didn't categorize it as loneliness, he replied. I categorized it as necessity. That sentence lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. Necessity, not healing, not processing, not grieving, just continuing. And that was the foundation upon which Marcus built his entire life, including his marriage. He moved toward the window, looking out at the quiet city lights, the same way he had done on countless nights after long workdays. Stillness made him reflective, but reflection made him uncomfortable, so he often disguised it as observation. When my father died, he said, voice steady, everything became urgent. The company, the family reputation, financial stability. There wasn't time to pause. Elena listened without interrupting, because sometimes emotional conversations require patience more than responses. If I stopped, he continued, everything would have felt overwhelming. He didn't say the word grief. He never did. Instead, he used words like overwhelming, inefficient, unproductive, words that kept emotions at a safe intellectual distance. And suddenly, something inside Elena shifted, not in pain, but in understanding. For years, she had interpreted Marcus's emotional restraint as detachment, but now she was beginning to see it differently. Wasn't detachment. It was conditioning. There is a powerful life lesson hidden in moments like this. We often judge our partner's emotional behavior without understanding the emotional environment that shaped them. She leaned back slightly against the headboard. That's why you keep moving, she said softly, even during emotional situations. Yes, that's why you didn't postpone the party. He didn't deny it. Yes? The honesty was almost disarming. Not defensive, not argumentative, just transparent. I believed maintaining normal structure would prevent emotional collapse, he added. Elena closed her eyes briefly. And for you, it probably does. He didn't respond, but his silence confirmed it. For Marcus, productivity had always been armor. For Elena, emotional expression had always been release. 2 coping systems. 1 marriage. Years of quiet misalignment. Marcus, she said gently, do you realize you approach emotions the same way you approach business problems? He slightly. In what sense? You analyze. You stabilize. You optimize. You manage. She paused, choosing her words carefully, not to accuse, but to educate. But emotions aren't systems. They're experiences. That sentence lingered, and for the first time since the party, Marcus looked genuinely thoughtful rather than composed. I don't try to manage your emotions, he said slowly. She tilted her head slightly. You don't manage my emotions, she agreed softly. You manage the environment around them. Silence again. But this silence felt different, not distant, revealing. You kept conversations short tonight, she continued. You redirected journalists. You adjusted expectations. That was intentional. I know, and that was your version of support. Yes, she gave a small, tired smile. That's what makes this complicated. He studied her expression more closely now. Explain. She hesitated, not because she didn't know what to say, but because saying it out loud would reshape years of quiet assumptions. You care, she said. You're consistent. Another pause. But you don't sit inside emotions with people. You work around them. That statement did not offend him. It intrigued him because it was accurate. Educational insight. Some partners offer emotional support by presence. Others offer support by problem solving. Conflict arises when one expects presence while the other delivers solutions. Marcus sat down slowly across from her. When you cry, he said, thinking aloud, my instinct is to identify the cause and remove it. And when I cry, she replied gently, my instinct isn't for the problem to be removed immediately. It's to feel understood first. He absorbed that in silence. Not resisting, not dismissing, processing. You're not asking me to fix grief, he said after a moment. No, you're asking me to acknowledge it. Yes? That single exchange carried more emotional education than any argument could have. Because arguments often focus on blame, but awareness focuses on patterns. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, a rare posture for someone who usually maintained perfect composure. When my father died, he said slowly, people respected me more when I stayed strong. She listened carefully. They praised my composure, my discipline, my productivity. He paused. No one praised emotional vulnerability. And that, right there, was the root of everything. A young boy rewarded for suppressing grief becomes a man who believes emotional restraint equals strength. It wasn't cruelty. It was learned survival. Elena felt a quiet heaviness in her chest. Not sadness for herself, but empathy for him. For the first time, she saw the teenage version of Marcus more clearly than the billionaire CEO standing before her. You weren't given space to grieve properly, she said softly. I was given responsibility instead, and responsibility replaced emotion. Yes, another long silence settled, but this one felt strangely grounding. Not tense, not fragile, just honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is one of the most educational turning points in any relationship. You what Wham used to tell me, Elena said quietly. He looked up. She said emotional intelligence isn't about reacting perfectly. It's about understanding why someone reacts the way they do. Marcus remained silent, but attentive. And I'm starting to understand you, she added. That statement affected him more than she realized. Because understanding, not criticism, is what disarms defensive minds. I misjudged what you needed yesterday, he admitted. The words were measured, but sincere. You needed emotional space, he continued. I provided structured activity. She nodded slowly. Yes, I believed activity would reduce emotional pain. And sometimes, she said gently, activity just delays it. That lesson hung quietly in the room, like a truth neither of them had fully acknowledged before. Outside, the night remained calm. Inside, something subtle was shifting. Not dramatic change, not instant transformation, just awareness. And awareness is always the first step toward emotional growth. Marcus leaned back slightly, his voice quieter now. I am not naturally skilled at emotional processing, he said. She gave a faint, understanding smile. I know, but I am capable of learning patterns, he added. That was the most Marcus-like statement possible. Even growth, to him, was something structured. And yet, beneath that structure, there was effort. Real effort. You don't have to become emotionally different overnight, she said softly. I just need you to stop assuming my coping style should match yours. He nodded once. That is reasonable. For the first time since her mother's funeral, Elena felt something unexpected settle inside her chest. Not relief, not closure, but clarity. Clarity that their problem wasn't lack of love. It was lack of emotional alignment during grief. And that is a deeply educational truth many couples discover too late. Love can exist strongly, even when emotional understanding is still developing. As the room grew quieter and the conversation naturally slowed, Marcus stood and turned off the overhead light, leaving only the softer bedside lamp glowing. He didn't offer dramatic comfort. He didn't say poetic words. Instead, he did something small. He stayed, not working, not analyzing, not leaving the room, just present. And sometimes, for a person conditioned to keep moving, presence is the first real act of emotional growth. Unpolished, imperfect, but intentional. And Elena noticed, because even in grief, the heart recognizes effort before it recognizes perfection. Grief is quiet, but public life is not. 3 days after the promotion party, the house no longer smelled like fresh flowers or catered meals. The noise had faded. The guests were on. The champagne glasses were washed and stored away. On the surface, everything had returned to normal. And that was the problem. Because nothing inside Elena felt normal. She stood in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting the sleeve of a soft black blouse, her movements slow and deliberate. Not out of vanity, out of fatigue. Not physical fatigue, emotional fatigue. The kind that lingers in your chest even after you've slept. Her phone buzzed softly on the dresser. Another notification, another message, another headline. CEO Marcus Hale celebrates major promotion with elegant private event. Elegant, private, successful? She stared at the screen for a long second before placing the phone face down. No headline mentioned the funeral that happened just hours before that elegant event. Why would they? The world only documents what it sees, not what people silently endure. Have you ever noticed how society praises composure without asking what it costs? That realization settled heavily in her chest as she walked out of the bedroom and into the quiet hallway. Downstairs, the house staff moved gently, respectfully quieter than usual since the funeral. Even they seemed to sense the emotional atmosphere, adjusting their tone and footsteps accordingly. But grief does not live in silence alone. Lives in routine, in empty chairs, in quiet mornings, in the absence of the one person who used to call just to ask if you ate breakfast. Elena, good morning, Mrs. Carter, the house manager said softly. Elena nodded politely. Good morning. You have a light schedule today. Only the foundation meeting in the afternoon. Of course, meetings, commitments, responsibilities, life, once again, moving forward without asking permission. That's fine, Elena replied gently. And once again, she used the most automatic phrase of emotionally strong people. That's fine. Educational truth. People who are emotionally resilient often appear functional long before they are emotionally ready. She walked into the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had stood holding that silver tray days ago, and paused briefly. The memory lingered, not dramatically, but quietly. The refrigerator hummed again. The sunlight fell across the counter, the same way it had that morning. Ordinary. Everything looked ordinary, which made the emotional contrast even sharper. Marcus entered a few moments later, already dressed for work, his presence as composed as ever. His routine had resumed with near-perfect precision. Early calls, scheduled meetings, strategic briefings. Structure, always structure. Good morning, he said calmly. Good morning. He noticed it immediately. Not her appearance, not her posture, her energy. Marcus was not emotionally expressive, but he was observant. And observant people notice shifts others overlook. You slept, he said, not as a question. Yes, but not deeply, not peacefully, just enough for the body to continue functioning. He walked toward the coffee machine, preparing 2 cups the same way he always did. One black for himself, one lightly sweetened for her. A small habit. Consistent. Reliable. He placed her cup gently on the counter beside her. No dramatic words. No forced comfort. Just quiet consistency. And that, in its own way, was a form of care. But care expressed through routine can sometimes feel emotionally distant during grief. My assistant informed me that several media outlets are requesting interviews, he said. They declined. She looked up slightly. All of them? Yes. Why? He paused, then answered simply. Because they want narratives, not truth. That response surprised her more than she expected. The truth? She asked quietly. That you attended a funeral hours before that event, he replied. And that is not something I will allow to be publicly dissected. Silence filled the space between them. Not tense, not heavy, just thoughtful, because that was another side of Marcus most people never saw. Protective, not emotionally expressive, but strategically protective. Educational insight. Some partners protect privacy instead of displaying public emotional support. It may not feel warm, but it is still intentional care. I didn't realize you declined them for that reason, she admitted. I do not make decisions solely based on professional optics, he said. She studied him quietly. That sentence carried more emotional weight than it appeared on the surface. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an old friend. You looked so graceful at the party. I don't know how you stayed so strong. Elena's fingers paused over the screen. Strong, graceful, composed. Words people use when they witness endurance, but not the cost behind it. She placed the phone down, vowelly. Everyone keeps saying I was strong, she murmured. Marcus leaned slightly against the counter, watching her expression carefully. And that bothers you? Yes. Why? Because strength felt like a performance. Because composure felt like emotional suppression. Because no one had asked if she was okay, only how she managed to appear okay. Because strength is sometimes just silence in disguise, she said softly. That answer lingered, and for the first time in that conversation, Marcus didn't respond immediately. He processed, internally, systematically. You were composed, he said after a moment. But composure does not indicate emotional absence. She blinked slightly. That was unexpectedly perceptive. You're becoming more observant emotionally, she said quietly. I am applying recent information, he replied. And somehow, that almost made her smile. Because even his emotional growth sounded structured. But it was still growth. And growth, even when imperfect, deserves acknowledgement. The morning remained calm. But beneath that calm was an emotional tension neither of them openly named. Grief was still present. Public expectations were still present. And now, a new layer had quietly emerged. Societal perception. By noon, the foundation meeting approached. A commitment Elena had agreed to weeks ago, long before loss entered her life. As she prepared to leave, Marcus spoke again. You do not have to attend if you are not emotionally prepared. She paused mid-step. That was new, very new. I thought you believed in maintaining structure, she said gently. I do, he replied, but I am beginning to understand that emotional recovery does not follow structured timelines. That sentence settled deeply in her chest, not as comfort, but as progress. Slow, measured, intentional. Have you noticed something important in their relationship? He was not transforming overnight. He was adjusting gradually. And realistic love stories are not about sudden emotional perfection. They are about consistent, imperfect effort. She picked up her bag. I'll attend, she said softly. Not because I feel ready, but because I need to step outside the house. That is a reasonable decision. As they walked toward the door together, the outside world looked exactly the same as it always did. Cars passing, people working, life continuing. But inside Elena, something had shifted slightly. Not healing, not resolution, just awareness. Awareness that grief in private and expectations in public are two very different emotional battles. And she was now fighting both at the same time, without dramatic breakdowns, without loud complaints, without visible collapse, just quiet endurance. And quiet endurance, though often noted as strength, is one of the most emotionally exhausting states a person can live in. As the car door closed behind her, Elena looked out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, composed on the outside, processing on the inside. And for the first time since the funeral, a question surfaced in her mind that she had been avoiding. Not, does my husband care, but something much deeper. Does he understand how grief actually feels, or only how it should be managed? That question would soon shape everything that followed. The foundation building was quieter than usual. Not empty, not silent, just respectfully subdued. Word had traveled, not loudly, not publicly, but through the soft channels of social circles and professional networks. People knew Elena had lost her mother. And yet, as always, society responded in the most familiar way, with politeness instead of emotional space. "I'm so sorry for your loss," one board member said gently as she entered the conference room. Elena nodded. "Thank you." Another soft handshake. Another sympathetic look. Another moment of composed acknowledgement. Grief in public spaces is a delicate performance. You cannot collapse. You cannot overshare. You cannot fully express what your heart is carrying. So you simplify it into 2 words. Thank you. She took her seat at the long, polished table, placing her notebook neatly in front of her, even though she already knew she would barely process half of what was discussed today. Across the room, presentations began. Budget outlines, outreach plans, community programs, voices speaking in measured, professional tones. Ordinary conversations, ordinary responsibilities, ordinary expectations. And yet, internally, nothing felt ordinary. Her mind drifted unexpectedly to the hospital room weeks ago. The quiet beeping machines, her mother's tired smile, the way she had squeezed Elena's hand and said, "Don't rush your feelings. Let them breathe." That memory alone made her chest tighten. Educational truth. Unprocessed grief often resurfaces during routine moments, not dramatic ones. "Elena, would you like to review the final proposal?" Someone asked politely. She blinked, refocusing. "Yes, of course." She leaned forward, reading the document, forcing her attention to follow each line. And, for a moment, she managed. She listened. She contributed. She even asked a thoughtful question about one of the outreach programs. From the outside, she looked composed, functional, capable, strong. But inside, her emotional energy was being stretched thinner with every passing minute. This is one of the most overlooked emotional lessons in adulthood. You can perform well and still be emotionally exhausted at the same time. After the meeting ended, several members approached her individually, their voices softer now. "You handled everything so gracefully the other night," one woman said. "I don't know how you stayed so strong," another added. Graceful, strong, composed. Each compliment felt heavier than the last, because none of them were wrong. But none of them were fully right either. Grace wasn't what she felt. Strength wasn't what she felt. Endurance was what she felt, and endurance is rarely visible. She smiled politely, thanked them, and stepped out into the hallway, her breathing slightly slower now, as if her body was finally acknowledging the emotional effort it had just spent. Her phone buzzed again. "Marcus, how is the meeting?" Simple, direct, practical. She stared at the message for a moment before replying. "Productive. I'm leaving now." 3 seconds later, another message appeared. Driver is already outside. She paused. Of course he had arranged that. Not after she asked. Not after she complained. But quietly, in advance. That was Marcus's pattern. He didn't always ask emotional questions first, but he anticipated logistical needs instinctively. Educational insight. Some partners show care through preparation rather than verbal reassurance. Outside, the air was cool and calm. She stepped into the car and leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes briefly. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to stop performing. Just for a moment. No polite smiles, no composed posture, no professional responses, just quiet breathing. And with that stillness, the emotional weight she had been carrying all morning slowly surfaced again. Not explosively, not dramatically, just heavily. By the time she arrived home, the house felt even quieter than before. Marcus was already there. That alone was unusual. He typically returned much later in the evening, often absorbed in back-to-back meetings and strategic reviews. But today, he sat in the living room, laptop closed, phone placed face down on the table. Waiting, not working, waiting. That small detail did not go unnoticed. "You're home early," she said softly as she stepped inside. Yes, no elaborate explanation, just presence. She set her bag down gently. "The meeting went well?" he asked. Did. He studied her for a moment, longer than usual. "You are more fatigued than you were this morning." Nod, a question, an observation. She exhaled slowly. Public interactions require a different kind of energy. He nodded once, as if storing that information mentally. "They kept saying I was strong," she added after a pause. "And that response did not feel supportive," he concluded. She looked at him, slightly surprised again. "You're learning faster than I expected." "I am listening more than I used to," he replied calmly. That sentence, simple as it was, carried quiet emotional progress. She walked toward the couch and sat down, her posture finally relaxing in a way it hadn't all day. "It's strange," she said softly. "People admire composure during grief, but they don't realize how much energy it takes to maintain it." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together. "Because composure is visible," he said. "Emotional cost is not." She stared at him. That insight was not something the old Marcus would have verbalized. "You've been thinking," she observed. "Yes, about your statement 2 nights ago." She frowned slightly. "Which one?" "That emotions are experiences, not systems." Silence settled again, but not uncomfortable this time. Reflective. "I'm beginning to understand that my instinct to create structure during emotional situations may unintentionally create emotional distance," he continued. There it was. Awareness, not defensiveness, not justification, just awareness. And awareness is one of the most educational turning points in any relationship. "I never thought you didn't care," Elena said gently. "I just felt alone in how I was processing everything." He absorbed that quietly. "Alone despite companionship," he said. "Yes." Another pause. "I did not intend to create emotional isolation," he admitted. "I know." And she meant it. That, the complicated truth. He had never been emotionally neglectful on purpose. He had simply been emotionally conditioned. The difference matters lot. Have you noticed something important in their relationship dynamic? There is no shouting, no accusations, no dramatic conflict. Just 2 adults slowly understanding the psychological patterns behind their reactions. And that is a far more realistic representation of long-term love. I keep moving because stillness amplifies unresolved thoughts, Marcus said after a moment. And I need stillness to process emotions, Elena replied. 2 opposite coping mechanisms, both valid, both human, both misunderstood when not communicated properly. He leaned back slightly. Then the logical solution, he said, pausing briefly, is not for either of us to change our coping style entirely. She tilted her head, but to respect the difference. He finished. Her chest tightened slightly. Not in pain this time, but in quiet relief. That, she said softly, is the most emotionally intelligent thing you've said since the funeral. He did not smile, but the tension in his posture eased just slightly. For the first time since her loss, their conversation didn't feel like emotional misalignment. It felt like gradual alignment. Not perfect, not complete, but progressing. Outside, the late afternoon light filtered gently through the windows, casting soft shadows across the room. And in that quiet space, something subtle but meaningful was happening. Marcus was not trying to fix her grief. He was learning to sit beside it. Perfectly, quietly, deliberately, and Elena, for the first time in days, did not feel pressured to appear strong. She simply felt seen, not completely understood yet, but no longer emotionally invisible. That alone was progress. And progress in emotionally complex relationships is rarely loud. It is measured in small shifts, small realizations, small adjustments in behavior that slowly reshape emotional safety. As the room settled into a calm silence, Elena leaned back against the couch, her voice softer now. "My mom used to say something," she murmured. Marcus looked at her attentively. She said the strongest relationships aren't the ones without emotional differences. The ones where both people are willing to understand those differences over time. He nodded once. That is a sustainable model. And for the first time since the chaos began, Elena allowed herself to close her eyes, not out of exhaustion alone, but out of something quieter, a fragile, growing sense that while her grief was still heavy, she was no longer carrying it entirely alone. Sympathy fades faster than grief. In the first few days after a loss, people call. They message. They soften their tone. They offer condolences, wrapped in gentle words and careful pauses. But then life resumes. When life resumes for everyone else, grief becomes quieter for the person who is still living inside it. 1 week after the funeral, the house felt different. Not empty, not cold, just emotionally settled, in a way that was harder to explain. The flowers had been cleared. The condolence cards were neatly stacked. The phone notifications had slowed. Routine had returned, but Elena had not. She stood by the living room window that morning, watching the sunlight stretch across the polished floor. Her hands rested loosely against her arms, not out of discomfort, but out of quiet self-containment. She had slept. She had eaten. She had attended meetings. She had responded to messages. Functionally, she was doing everything right. Emotionally, she felt delayed. Have you ever noticed how grief doesn't always arrive all at once? Sometimes it waits. It waits until the noise disappears, until the sympathy quiets, until you're finally alone with your thoughts. And then it settles in, slowly, deeply, persistently. Behind her, the soft sound of a laptop closing echoed through the room. Marcus, he had been working from home more often this week. Not announced, not discussed, just quietly adjusted. "You've been standing there for 9 minutes, he said calmly. She didn't turn immediately. "I didn't realize you timing me. I was observing," he corrected. That was Marcus's language. Observation instead of assumption. Analysis instead of intrusion. She finally turned slightly, offering a faint, tired smile. "I wasn't thinking about anything specific," she said. "That is unlikely." She exhaled softly. "You're right." He waited, not interrupting, not filling the silence, just waiting. A week ago, he would have redirected the conversation or suggested a task. Now he stayed quiet, and that silence, though small, was significant. Educational truth. Learning to sit in silence with someone's emotions is a form of emotional growth, especially for people conditioned to fix instead of feel. I keep expecting my phone to ring, she admitted, quietly, even though I know it won't. Marcus's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but attentively. Your mother used to call you daily, he said. Yes, at 8:15 a.m. She blinked, surprised. You noticed that? Yes, another small realization. He noticed patterns, even emotional ones. I used to rush those calls sometimes, she whispered. I'd tell her I'd call back later, or that I was busy. Her voice didn't break. It softened. And now, she continued, I would give anything for one more unnecessary conversation. Silence filled the room again. Heavy, real, unavoidable. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't care, but because he was learning that not every emotional statement required a solution. I regret not encouraging you to take more of those calls, he said after a moment. She turned toward him, surprised again. You never discouraged them. I prioritized efficiency, he replied. And efficiency often shortens moments that later become emotionally significant. That sentence stayed in the air, longer than expected. Educational insight. In highly structured lives, meaningful emotional moments are often unintentionally minimized in the name of productivity. Elena walked slowly toward the couch and sat down, her movements quieter than usual. I don't think the grief fully hit me during the funeral, she admitted, or even during the party. That aligns with delayed emotional processing, Marcus said. She looked at him. You've been searching grief, haven't you? Yes. And what did your research conclude? That grief is not linear, he replied calmly. It does not follow schedules, deadlines, or expected emotional timelines. For a brief second, she almost laughed. Not out of humor, out of irony. You're studying grief like it's a business model, she said gently. I am studying it like a human experience I was never properly taught to navigate. That answer disarmed her more than any comforting phrase could have, because it was honest, unpolished, effortful, and effort, especially from emotionally reserved people, carries deep significance. The house remained quiet, too quiet, and that quietness began to reveal something neither of them had fully confronted yet: the absence of distraction. No guests, no events, no structured obligations, just space. And space is where emotions become louder. Marcus sat across from her, his posture less rigid than usual. You have been functioning consistently, he observed. That's not the same as healing, she replied softly. I am aware. Another pause. I don't feel broken, she added after a moment. I feel heavy, emotionally heavy, he clarified. Yes, he nodded once, absorbing that distinction, because to him, categorizing emotions helped him understand them better. Educational truth. Labeling emotions accurately helps prevent emotional suppression and miscommunication in relationships. I used to think grief looked dramatic, she continued, crying constantly, not eating, not functioning. And your experience differs, he said. Yes. Mine feels quieter, like something sitting in my chest all day. He leaned forward slightly. That is consistent with internalized grief patterns. She gave him a faint look. You're really committed to understanding this, aren't you? Yes. Why? The question was simple, but the answer required emotional honesty. He didn't respond immediately, because this was not a logistical question. It was a relational one. Because, he said slowly, I recognize that my default response to emotional distress has historically been ineffective in emotionally supportive contexts. She blinked. That is the most structured way anyone has ever admitted they were emotionally unavailable. I was not unavailable, he corrected calmly. I was misaligned. That word landed deeply. Misaligned. Not uncaring. Not distant. Not indifferent. Just misaligned. And suddenly, years of small misunderstandings felt clearer. She leaned back slightly, her voice softer now. You know what's strange? What? I don't resent you for the party. He studied her carefully. I resented the expectation, she continued, not the intention. That distinction mattered more than either of them realized. Because resentment rooted in expectation can be resolved. Resentment rooted in lack of care is much harder to heal. I expected emotional space, she added. You expected structured resilience. Yes, and neither of us said that out loud. Yes, silence again. But this silence felt productive rather than heavy, reflective rather than distant. Outside, a car passed quietly along the street. Inside, something subtle was happening. For the first time since her loss, Elena wasn't just enduring grief. She was articulating it. And articulation is one of the most educational steps in emotional healing. I miss her in ordinary moments, she whispered suddenly. Marcus did not interrupt. In the kitchen, in the morning, when I reach for my phone, when something small happens, and I instinctively think, I should tell Mom. Her fingers tightened slightly in her lap. And then I remember he remained silent, not because he lacked words, but because he was finally understanding that presence, not solutions, was what she needed in these moments. So, instead of offering advice, instead of suggesting distraction, instead of restructuring her day, Marcus Hale did something he had rarely done before. He stayed in the discomfort of the moment, fully, quietly, deliberately, and that, though invisible to most, was one of the most significant emotional changes in their marriage so far. That afternoon passed without urgency. No meetings, no public appearances, no structured obligations demanding composure. Just time. And time, when grief is present, behaves differently. It stretches, it slows, it lingers in ordinary moments that once felt insignificant. Elena remained on the couch longer than she intended, her hands loosely folded in her lap, her gaze drifting between the window and the quiet room. The house staff moved discreetly in the background, their presence respectful but distant, as if the entire household understood that emotional space was needed more than service. Marcus, for once, did not return to his office. He stayed in the same room, not working, not pacing, not taking calls. Staying, that alone, marked a behavioral shift, significant enough to be noticed. You're not taking your afternoon calls, she said softly after a while. They have been rescheduled. She glanced at him. For how long? For as long as necessary. That answer was calm, but it carried a quiet weight. Because for a man whose life had always revolved around schedules, deadlines, and structured efficiency, rescheduling work was not a casual decision. Educational truth. Behavioral adjustments often communicate care more clearly than verbal reassurance. I didn't ask you to do that, she said gently. You did not. Then why? He paused briefly, as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. Because I am beginning to understand that emotional presence cannot be delegated or postponed without relational consequences. She blinked slowly. That sentence was not poetic. It was not emotionally expressive, but it was deeply intentional. And intention, especially from emotionally reserved individuals, is often the clearest sign of growth. The room fell quiet again, but this silence felt less heavy than the days before. Not because the grief had lessened, but because it was no longer being carried in isolation. After a few minutes, Elena stood and walked toward the kitchen, not out of hunger, out of habit. Grief often drives people back into routines, because routines feel familiar when emotions feel uncertain. She opened the cabinet, stared briefly at the neatly arranged cups, and froze. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "You always skip lunch when you're overwhelmed." Her fingers tightened slightly against the cabinet door. She hadn't realized she had done exactly that. Again, Marcus appeared quietly at the doorway, observing, not intruding. "You have not eaten since breakfast," he said. She exhaled faintly. "I wasn't hungry." "That may be physiological," he replied. "Or emotional." She turned toward him, a faint, tired smile appearing. "You're analyzing my eating habits now. I am observing behavioral patterns associated with grief." That almost made her laugh. Almost. "You know," she said gently, reaching for a glass of water, "most people would just say, 'You should eat.' That would address the symptom," he responded calmly, "but not the cause." Educational insight. Emotionally analytical individuals often focus on root causes rather than surface behaviors, which can feel distant but is not inherently uncaring. She leaned lightly against the counter, sipping the water slowly. "My mom used to remind me to eat," she murmured. Silence followed. Not abrupt, not awkward, just emotionally real. "She would call and ask what I had for lunch," Elena continued softly. "And if I said coffee, she'd lecture me for 5 minutes." Marcus absorbed that quietly. "And you found that comforting," he said. "Yes, despite the lecture." "Yes," she repeated, a faint smile touching her lips before fading. "Because it meant she was paying attention." That sentence lingered heavily in the air. Paying attention. Not solving. Not fixing. Not managing. Just noticing. Marcus leaned slightly against the doorway, his posture less rigid than usual. "I am attempting to pay closer attention," he admitted. She looked at him, studying his expression carefully. "I can tell. And is that helpful?" he asked, the question unusually direct. She considered her answer carefully. "Yes," she said, "but it feels unfamiliar." "Unfamiliar in a negative sense?" "No," she replied softly. "Unfamiliar in a new sense." That distinction mattered, because emotional growth in long-term relationships often feels unfamiliar before it feels comfortable. She placed the glass down gently. "I think the hardest part of grief," she continued, "is that it interrupts your emotional rhythm." "Explain," he said. "You're used to a certain emotional baseline," she said slowly. "Certain conversations, certain routines, certain emotional supports." She paused. "And when one of those supports disappears, everything else feels slightly off balance." He nodded once, processing. "That aligns with psychological dependency models," he said. She gave him a look of mild amusement. "You always translate emotions into structured concepts." "That is how I understand them," he replied calmly. Educational truth. People process emotions differently, some through expression, others through analysis. Neither method is wrong, but mutual understanding is essential for healthy communication. She walked back toward the living room, moving slower now, less out of exhaustion and more out of reflection. Marcus followed shortly after, maintaining a respectful distance rather than hovering. That was another adjustment. Previously, he would have filled silence with practical suggestions. Now, he allowed emotional pacing to exist naturally. "You know what I realized this morning," Elena said as she sat down again. "What?" "I wasn't actually thinking when I stood by the window." He remained attentive. "I was feeling," she clarified. "And that distinction is significant," he replied. "Yes," she said softly, "because I think I've spent most of the past week functioning instead of feeling." Silence again, but this silence carried clarity. rather than confusion. Educational insight. Functioning during grief is a survival mechanism, not a sign of emotional recovery. I believed activity would protect you from emotional overwhelm, Marcus admitted after a moment. And now, I believe emotional acknowledgement may reduce long-term psychological strain. She blinked. That, a very technical way of saying, feel your feelings. Yes, for the first time that day, she let out a quiet, genuine laugh. Short, soft, but real. And that small moment carried more emotional significance than either of them acknowledged aloud. Because laughter, even brief, is often the first sign that emotional heaviness is being shared, rather than suppressed. The late afternoon light shifted gradually across the room, casting longer shadows against the floor. Time moved. Slowly, gently, and in that slowed space, Elena felt something she hadn't allowed herself to fully recognize yet. She was no longer emotionally alone in her grief. Not because Marcus suddenly became emotionally expressive. Not because he transformed overnight, but because he stayed present instead of retreating into structure. I'm still angry about the party, she admitted suddenly. He did not flinch. That is reasonable, he replied calmly. I understand why you didn't postpone it, she continued. But it still hurt. Yes, no defensiveness, no justification, just acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in emotionally complex relationships is often more healing than explanation. I wish you had asked what I needed, instead of deciding what would help, she said quietly. That is a valid critique, he responded. Another pause. I am accustomed to anticipating needs based on logic, he added. But emotional needs require direct communication. She nodded slowly. They do. Silence settled once more, but this time it felt lighter. Not empty, not tense, just honest. And honesty, especially in grief, creates emotional space where healing can begin. Slowly, imperfectly, realistically. As evening approached and the house grew quieter again, Elena leaned back into the couch, her voice softer than before. My grief isn't dramatic, she said. It's quiet, persistent, present in ordinary moments. Marcus remained still, listening fully. And I think, she added gently, I don't need solutions right now. He nodded once. Then I will not provide them. And I don't need you to fix how I feel. I understand. She looked at him carefully. I just need you to stay. A simple request, not emotional transformation, not grand gestures, not perfect understanding, just presence. Marcus held her gaze for a brief moment before responding with the quiet certainty that defined him. I can do that. And for the first time since the funeral, Elena felt something shift internally. Not healing, not closure, but emotional safety. Fragile, new, gradual, and sometimes, in the midst of grief, emotional safety is the first real step toward learning how to live with loss, without having to carry it entirely alone. If you're still listening, it means this story is touching something real inside you. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more deeply emotional love stories that don't just entertain. They teach powerful life lessons about grief, marriage, and emotional growth. Tell me honestly, in the comments, do you think emotional presence is more important than problem solving during difficult times? Because in real relationships, love is not always about fixing pain. Sometimes it's simply about staying when emotions get heavy. Stay with me because in the next chapter, the emotional tension deepens as Elena's quiet grief begins to clash with the expectations of normal life. And Marcus faces a moment where presence alone may no longer be enough. Normal life has a quiet way of returning before the heart is ready. Not loudly, not suddenly, but gradually. Mail's resume, schedules fill, conversations shift back to routine topics. And one day, you realize the world has moved forward, while a part of you is still standing still. 2 weeks after the funeral, Elena noticed it first in the smallest way. Her calendar, it was no longer empty. Foundation meetings, social commitments, charity planning sessions, A dinner invitation from a long-time family associate. Ordinary responsibilities. Ordinary expectations. Extraordinary emotional weight. She sat at the dining table that morning, staring at the neatly organized planner in front of her, her fingers resting lightly against the page, but not turning it. The sunlight filtered through the large windows, exactly the same way it had every other morning. Everything looked normal, which made the internal contrast sharper. Marcus entered a few minutes later, already dressed for work, tablet in hand, movements as precise as ever, but slightly slower than usual. A subtle adjustment. Only someone who lived with him closely would notice. "You have 3 scheduled commitments this week," he said calmly. She didn't respond immediately. "I saw," she replied softly. Another pause followed. Not tense, not confrontational, just emotionally thoughtful. "You do not appear enthusiastic," he observed. She let out a quiet breath. "I'm not." He placed the tablet down instead of continuing to scroll. A small but intentional behavioral change. Educational truth. When someone pauses their routine to engage emotionally, it signals prioritization, even if they don't verbalize it directly. "I don't know how to return to normal life yet," she admitted. "What aspect of normal life feels most difficult?" He asked. She almost smiled faintly. "You ask questions, like a researcher." "I am attempting to understand variables," he replied. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "The expectations," she said after a moment. "The assumption that 2 weeks is enough time to emotionally adjust." He nodded once. "That assumption is statistically inaccurate." She blinked. "You're analyzing grief timelines now?" "Yes." "What did your research say?" "That emotional recovery after loss varies significantly based on relational attachment and psychological processing style." She shook her head gently, a soft exhale escaping her. "You translate emotions into data." "It's how I avoid misinterpretation," he answered. That honesty was becoming more frequent, more direct, more intentional. And yet, despite his growing awareness, something inside Elena still felt off. Not because he wasn't trying, but because her grief was no longer in its initial stage. It was evolving, deepening, becoming quieter, but heavier. Have you ever noticed how grief changes form over time? At first, it is sharp and overwhelming. Then it becomes quiet and persistent. And eventually, it settles into ordinary moments. Unexpected, subtle, and emotionally complex. "I don't cry every day," she said suddenly. Marcus looked at her attentively. "But I think about her every day." He remained silent, allowing her to continue. "In small moments," she added, "when I make tea, when I walk past my phone, when something happens, and my first instinct is to tell her." Her voice stayed steady. Not breaking, not dramatic, just honest. "That indicates continued emotional attachment," he said softly. "Yes, and emotional attachment does not dissolve on a fixed timeline." "No," she replied quietly. Silence followed, but this silence felt different from previous ones. Heavier, more reflective, because now they were no longer discussing the initial shock of loss. They were discussing the long-term presence of grief. Marcus folded his hands lightly on the table. "I may have underestimated the duration of your emotional recovery," he admitted. She looked at him. "That's not unusual," she said gently. "Most people underestimate grief because it becomes less visible over time. Educational insight, visible grief, receives support. Quiet grief is often overlooked." A notification sound broke the silence. Her phone lit up with a reminder. "Dinner, Thursday, 7:30 p.m., Hale Corporate Circle." She stared at it for a long second, then locked the screen. Marcus noticed immediately. "You do not want to attend the dinner," he concluded. "It feels too soon," she said softly. Social environments require emotional performance, he observed. Yes, and emotional performance, while grieving, increases psychological fatigue. She blinked slowly. That is exactly how it feels. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she asked the question she had been quietly holding back. Marcus, when you returned to work after your father died, did anyone expect you to behave normally? Yes. And did you? Yes. Immediately? Yes. She studied his expression carefully. How did that affect you long term? He did not respond right away, because this was not a logistical question. This was emotional introspection. It normalized emotional suppression, he said finally. The honesty in that sentence shifted the atmosphere instantly. You're aware of that now, she said. Yes, and you don't want that for me? No. That answer came faster than usual, more instinctive, more certain. She lowered her gaze slightly, her fingers resting against the table. That's what makes this complicated, she whispered. Explain. You're trying to give me emotional space, she said, but life is still expecting normal behavior. He leaned back slightly, processing. That creates a conflict between internal emotional state and external social expectations. Yes, another pause. And that conflict is exhausting, he added. She nodded slowly. It is. Educational truth, one of the most emotionally draining experiences, is being expected to function normally while internally processing loss. The room grew quieter. Not empty, just emotionally aware. Marcus glanced briefly at the calendar on his tablet again, then back at her. The dinner invitation is optional, he said. It's not really optional, she replied gently. It's expected. He studied her expression more closely now. Expected by whom? Society. Business circles. People who equate presence with stability. Silence again. Then, in a rare moment of direct emotional clarity, Marcus spoke with unusual firmness. Your emotional well-being is not subordinate to social expectations. That sentence landed deeply, not loudly, but significantly. You're saying I shouldn't go? She asked. I'm saying, he replied calmly, that attending while emotionally unprepared may create unnecessary psychological strain. She leaned back slightly, absorbing his words. 2 weeks ago, this was the same man who insisted the promotion party proceed as planned. Now, he was advising emotional consideration over social obligation. Growth. Slow, measured, real. But growth does not immediately erase emotional tension. Because even as he adjusted, Elena was confronting a deeper internal struggle, not whether Marcus was trying, but whether she knew how to ask for what she truly needed. That realization was far more complex than grief itself. The dinner invitation stayed on her mind longer than she expected, not because it was important, but because of what it represented. Expectation, normalcy, performance. That evening, the house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that made small thoughts feel louder. Elena sat in the living room with the planner still open beside her, her eyes drifting over the scheduled events as if staring long enough might make them emotionally easier. Grief did not negotiate with calendars. Marcus walked in quietly after finishing a brief call, placing his phone face down on the table, a habit he had started recently whenever he sensed she needed emotional space rather than divided attention. You are still considering the dinner, he observed. Yes, you do not want to attend. No. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It reflective. She traced her finger lightly over the edge of the planner. I keep thinking about how people will interpret my absence, she admitted. In what way? They'll assume I'm withdrawn, or unstable, or unable to handle public expectations. Marcus leaned slightly against the arm of the chair, his posture composed but attentive. The assumption concerns you. Yes. Another pause. And yet, he continued calmly, attending while emotionally depleted may lead to greater internal strain than external judgment. She exhaled slowly. That's the logical conclusion, she said. But emotions aren't always logical. I am beginning to understand that. That admission was quiet, but meaningful. Educational truth. Emotional decisions are rarely about logic alone. They are often shaped by fear of perception, responsibility, and internal pressure. Elena closed the planner gently. I've spent most of my life being emotionally responsible, she said softly. Marcus watched her carefully. Responsible? In what sense? In the sense that I show up, she explained. Even when I'm tired. Even when I'm hurting. Even when I'm not ready. She paused, her voice steady but heavier now. My mom used to say I was her strong one. And you internalized that identity, he concluded. Yes, that is consistent with adaptive emotional roles in caregiving relationships. She gave him a faint look. You always make emotional psychology sound like a case study. I am trying to understand patterns, he replied calmly. What pattern do you see now? That you equate emotional endurance with personal responsibility. She blinked slowly. Because that was uncomfortably accurate. I don't know how to just not show up, she admitted quietly. Silence settled between them again. But this silence felt deeper than the previous ones. Not heavy, not tense, just revealing. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, but softer than usual. Not showing up is not the same as failing, he said. She looked at him. It feels like failing, she whispered, because you associate presence with strength. Yes, and absence with weakness. Another pause. Yes, educational insight. Many emotionally strong individuals struggle with boundaries because they equate rest with weakness and endurance with value. He absorbed that information carefully before speaking again. Your current emotional state is not weakness, he said. It is psychological processing. She almost smiled faintly. You're reframing grief like a structured phase. I am reframing it as a valid human response, he corrected. That distinction mattered more than it seemed. She leaned back against the couch, her shoulders finally relaxing just slightly. When my mom was sick, she said quietly, I didn't allow myself to emotionally collapse. Because you needed to remain functional, he replied. Yes, and now that the crisis has ended, your emotional system is no longer in survival mode. Her chest tightened slightly. That's exactly how it feels. Delayed emotional release, he said calmly. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not in pain, in recognition. Educational truth. When people suppress emotions during a crisis, grief often surfaces more strongly once the crisis ends. I thought the funeral would be the hardest part, she admitted. But it wasn't. Was this, she said softly, the quiet days after, the return to routine, the absence of distractions. Marcus remained silent, allowing her to continue uninterrupted. I keep expecting life to pause out of respect for loss, she added. But it doesn't. No, he said gently. It resumes, and that single word carried a quiet realism that felt grounding rather than dismissive. She opened her eyes again. I don't want to go to the dinner, she said, finally. The sentence was simple, but emotionally significant, because it was the first time she had clearly stated her need instead of emotionally negotiating with herself. Marcus did not respond immediately. Not out of hesitation. Out of intention. You are establishing a boundary, he said, after a moment. Yeah, and that boundary is based on emotional capacity. Yes, he nodded once. That is a psychologically healthy decision. She studied his expression. You're not disappointed. No, you're not concerned about professional perception? No, she blinked, surprised again. Why? Because long-term emotional stability has greater value than short-term social compliance, he replied calmly. That sentence settled deeply within her, not as dramatic comfort, but as emotional permission. Permission she hadn't given herself yet. I think I needed to hear that, she admitted softly. You should not require external permission to prioritize emotional well-being, he said. She gave a small, tired smile. Maybe not. But sometimes it helps when it comes from someone whose expectations usually revolve around structure. That observation was accurate, and he knew it. I am adjusting my expectations, he said simply. Silence followed again, but this time it felt lighter, more balanced, more aligned. Not because grief won, but because emotional pressure had reduced slightly. For the first time since the funeral, Elena felt something subtle shift inside her chest. Not relief, not healing, but emotional agency. The ability to acknowledge what she needed without guilt. Educational truth. Healing begins not when grief disappears, but when individuals allow themselves to honor their emotional limits without shame. I'll decline the dinner, she said softly. Marcus reached for his phone. I will inform them that scheduling constraints prevent attendance. She tilted her head slightly. You don't have to handle that. That's for me. I am aware, he replied, but I am choosing to support your boundary in a practical manner. She watched him for a moment, and something about that gesture, quiet, efficient, intentional, felt deeply aligned with who he was. He wasn't suddenly becoming emotionally expressive. He was integrating emotional awareness into his existing strengths. And that was realistic growth, not transformation, not personality change, just adaptation. You know, she said gently, you're still structured. Yes, but you're also becoming emotionally present within that structure. He paused briefly. Thou is an accurate assessment. For the first time in days, the silence between them did not feel heavy. It felt stable, safe, supportive, not because everything was resolved, not because grief had lessened, but because emotional expectations were finally being communicated instead of assumed. And that shift, quiet, intentional, gradual, marked the beginning of a healthier emotional dynamic between them. Not perfect, not dramatic, but real. And in real relationships, progress is rarely loud. It is built through small boundaries, honest conversations, and the courage to say, I am not ready yet, without apologizing for it. The days that followed were quieter, not empty, no peaceful, just emotionally steady, in a way that felt unfamiliar. Declining the dinner invitation did not cause the social collapse Elena had quietly feared. No dramatic reactions, no whispered judgments, no professional consequences, just a polite acknowledgement. And then life moved on. That realization alone carried an unexpected lesson. Sometimes the pressure we fear exists more in our minds than in reality. Still, grief did not disappear simply because external expectations softened. It changed shape. It settled deeper into ordinary routines. 3 weeks after the funeral, Elena noticed it in the mornings most of all. Mornings used to begin with a phone call. Now they began with silence. She stood in the kitchen again, holding a mug of tea she had reheated twice without drinking. The steam had faded. The warmth had cooled. And yet, she remained standing in the same spot, her thoughts drifting somewhere between memory and present awareness. Marcus entered quietly, already dressed, but without his usual urgency. You reheated that tea twice, he observed. She glanced down at the mug. I didn't realize you have been standing here for approximately 11 minutes. A faint, tired smile crossed her face. You measure time when you don't know what to say, don't you? Yes, when you do know what to say. I choose words more carefully. She nodded slightly. That honesty had become more frequent lately, more natural, more human. Educational truth. Emotional growth is often subtle. It appears first in observation, then in restraint, and finally in intentional presence. I used to call my mom during this time, she said softly, every morning, even if it was just for 5 minutes. Marcus remained still, listening. Now the silence feels louder than the conversations ever did. He didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't have something logical to say, but because he had learned that silence, when shared, could be more supportive than structured responses. I have noticed a shift in your morning behavior, he said finally. In what way? You remain in transitional spaces longer. She tilted her head slightly. Transitional spaces? Yes. The kitchen doorway, the hallway, the window. Locations associated with routine pauses. She blinked slowly. That observation was unexpectedly accurate. I think, she admitted quietly, I keep waiting for something familiar to happen. And when it does not, the absence becomes more noticeable. Yes. Another pause. Not heavy, not tense, just reflective. Grief, at this stage, was no longer sharp. It was persistent, subtle, integrated into daily rhythm. Later that afternoon, Elena decided to step outside for the first time in days, without a specific obligation. Not for a meeting, not for a scheduled task. Just to walk. The air was cool, calm, and quietly grounding. She walked slowly along the familiar path near their home, her steps unhurried, her thoughts drifting without direction. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to exist in a moment without emotional performance. No polite smiles, no composed posture, no expected conversations. Just movement and quiet reflection. When she returned nearly an hour later, she found Marcus in the living room, his laptop open but untouched. You went for a walk, he said. Yes, for 47 minutes. She raised an eyebrow faintly. You tracked that too? I noted your departure time. She exhaled softly, almost amused. You're observant. I am attentive. That word lingered. Attentive, not controlling, not intrusive. Just where. That distinction mattered. I think the walk helped, she admitted. In what way? It didn't make the grief disappear, she said, but it made it feel less confined. He nodded once. That aligns with environmental, emotional processing models. She gave him a look of gentle disbelief. You really are committed to understanding emotions through research. I am committed to understanding you, he corrected calmly. That sentence landed deeper than expected. Not dramatic, not romantic in the traditional sense, but deeply intentional. And intention, especially from someone emotionally reserved, carries significant emotional weight. Evening approached quietly. The house lights dimmed naturally as the sun set, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt less heavy. Not light, just manageable. Then Marcus's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it briefly and paused. A rare pause. Elena noticed immediately. What is it? She asked. He turned the screen off before responding. A board member has requested an urgent dinner meeting tomorrow evening. She watched his expression carefully. And it conflicts with your foundation event. Silence followed. But this silence felt different. Layered. Because this was no longer about grief alone. This about priorities. I can attend the foundation event alone, she said gently. That is not the primary concern. Then what is? He remained quiet for a moment, longer than usual. Then answered honestly, I have historically prioritized professional obligations during emotionally sensitive periods. She blinked slowly. You're aware of that pattern? Yes, and this is one of those moments. Yes, educational truth. Growth is not proven by words, but by decisions made when old habits are challenged. She leaned back slightly. You don't have to decline an important meeting because of me, she said. That statement assumes your emotional well-being is a secondary factor. I didn't say that. It was implied. Another pause. Calm, measured, real. I'm not in crisis, she added softly. I'm grieving. There's a difference. I am aware, he replied, but grief still requires emotional support structures. She studied him quietly. You're thinking very carefully before responding lately. Yes. Why? Because I am recognizing that my instinct to solve logistical problems may unintentionally neglect emotional context. That admission carried weight. Quiet weight. The kind that doesn't sound dramatic, but reflects deep internal reflection. You're being tested right now, aren't you? She asked gently. In what sense? In the sense that your natural instinct is to attend the urgent meeting. He did not deny it. Yes, and your learned adjustment is to consider emotional presence. Yes, silence again. But this silence held something new. Choice, not misunderstanding, not misalignment, but conscious decision-making. For the first time since the funeral, their relationship was no longer reacting to grief. It was actively evolving through it. And that evolution was about to be tested by something far more complex than emotional conversations. A real-life moment where Marcus would have to choose between the identity he had always lived by and the emotional presence he was only now learning to practice. The room stayed quiet long after the phone stopped vibrating. Marcus did not immediately return the call. That alone was unusual. Historically, urgency, especially professional urgency, received his immediate attention. Calls were returned within minutes. Decisions were made efficiently. Priorities were structured around impact, responsibility, and long-term outcomes. But now, he sat still, not frozen, not conflicted in an obvious way, just thinking. Elena watched him carefully, not with expectation, but with awareness. Over the past few weeks, she had learned something important about Marcus. His silences were rarely empty. They were processing phases. You're calculating, she said gently. Yes. Options? Yes. Or consequences? Both. That answer was honest, predictable, very Marcus. She folded her hands loosely in her lap, her posture relaxed but attentive. You can take the meeting, she said softly. I'll be fine. At Foundation event? He looked at her, not quickly, not dismissively, but directly. You are capable of attending alone, he said. Yes, that is not the determining factor. Silence settled again, but this time it carried more weight, because this wasn't about capability. It was about presence. Educational truth, emotional support is not always about necessity. Sometimes it is about intentional presence, even when the other person appears strong. My default decision, Marcus continued, would be to attend the urgent meeting. She nodded. I know, and historically, I would have justified that decision using professional responsibility. She did not interrupt. And you would have accepted that justification, he added. She tilted her head slightly. Yes, she admitted, because that was our normal. Normal. That word lingered. Normal had once meant structure, predictability, and emotional self-sufficiency. But grief had quietly redefined what normal meant in their marriage. And now, she asked softly. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting together in a rare sign of internal deliberation rather than external control. Now, he said slowly, I am evaluating whether repeating that pattern would reinforce emotional misalignment during a psychologically sensitive period. She blinked. That is a very analytical way of saying you're reconsidering your priorities. Yes, and what are you prioritizing? He did not respond immediately, because this question was no longer logistical. It was relational. You he said finally. The word was simple, adorned, unemotional in tone, but deeply intentional in meaning. Elena felt a subtle shift in her chest. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just quietly noticeable. You don't have to choose between work and me, she said gently. I am not choosing between work and you, he corrected. I am choosing between habit and growth. Silence followed. That distinction changed everything. Educational insight. True personal growth is revealed not when it is convenient, but when it challenges long-standing habits. She studied his expression carefully. You're afraid of making the wrong decision, she observed. Yes. Professionally? No. That surprised her. Emotionally? He clarified. Another pause. I have historically underestimated emotional timing, he continued, and I am attempting to avoid repeating that error. The honesty in that statement felt heavier than any apology, because it was not reactive. It was reflective. You're not the same person you were 3 weeks ago, she said quietly. No, and not because you changed your personality. No, but because you're adjusting your responses. Yes, that accuracy seemed to settle something between them. An unspoken acknowledgement that growth did not require dramatic transformation, only consistent awareness. His phone vibrated again on the table. Neither of them looked at it immediately. That, too, was new. Previously, it would have been answered without hesitation. Now, it remained face down, unattended, prioritized, not out of negligence, but out of deliberate choice. You're delaying a high-level board request, she said softly. Yes, that's unlike you. Yes, does that make you uncomfortable? He considered the question seriously. Yes, he admitted. Why? Because responsiveness has always been a core professional value. And emotional responsiveness? She asked gently. He paused. That is a value I am currently developing. That sentence carried quiet depth. Not defensive, not self-critical, just honest. Educational truth. Emotional growth often feels uncomfortable for individuals who were conditioned to prioritize productivity over presence. I don't want to become your emotional obligation, Elena said after a moment. You are not an obligation, he replied immediately. Then what am I in this situation? He answered without hesitation this time. My partner. The simplicity of that word held more emotional clarity than any elaborate explanation. And partners, he continued, require presence during emotionally transitional periods, even when they do not explicitly request it. She exhaled softly. You're learning to anticipate emotional needs instead of only logistical ones. Yes, and that's new. Yes, silence settled once more, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt grounded, intentional, steady. Marcus finally reached for his phone, not with urgency, but with calm decisiveness. He opened his messages, typed briefly, and then placed the phone back down. You declined it, she realized. Yes, for me. For us, he corrected, calmly. Another pause. You didn't have to do that, she said, quietly. I am aware. Then why did you? He looked her directly. Because emotional consistency is built through actions, not theoretical understanding. That sentence landed deeply. Not dramatic, not poetic, but profoundly educational. Educational insight, trust in emotionally evolving relationships is strengthened when behavioral actions align with newly expressed awareness. You're practicing, she said softly. Yes, practicing presence. Yes, and does that feel? She asked. He considered carefully. Unfamiliar, he admitted, but appropriate. For the first time that evening, Elena smiled faintly, not out of happiness, but out of recognition. Recognition of effort, of adjustment, gradual emotional evolution. I don't need you to abandon your responsibilities, she said gently. I just need to know that I'm not emotionally secondary during difficult periods. You are not, he replied. Another silence followed, but this one felt lighter than any before it. Not because grief had disappeared, not because emotional alignment was perfect, but because a new pattern was forming, a healthier one. Later that night, as they prepared for the next day's foundation event, Elena noticed something subtle but significant. Marcus reviewed his schedule, then adjusted it, then reviewed it again, not to optimize productivity, but to ensure availability. And that shift, quiet, invisible to the outside world, represented a deeper lesson about love than grand gestures ever could. Love, in emotionally mature relationships, is rarely about dramatic declarations. It is about consistent, intentional decisions made in ordinary moments. As the house settled into nighttime quiet, Elena sat by the window once more, the same place she had stood days ago in silence. But tonight felt different. The grief was still there, still heavy, still present in quiet waves. Yet something had changed. She no longer felt emotionally alone in managing it. Not because Marcus had suddenly become emotionally expressive, but because he was learning to stay, even when presence felt unfamiliar to him. And that effort, quiet and deliberate, was slowly reshaping the emotional foundation of their marriage. Not perfectly, not instantly, but realistically. One intentional decision at a time. Healing is rarely synchronized in relationships. One person processes internally, the other adjusts externally. One moves slowly through emotions, the other tries to create stability around them. And sometimes, even when both people are trying, their emotional timelines don't match. The morning of the foundation event arrived with a quiet stillness. Not tense, not heavy, just emotionally aware. Elena stood in front of the mirror, fastening the small clasp of her bracelet with careful precision, her movements slower than usual. Not because she lacked strength, but because every public outing still required a certain level of emotional preparation. Grief, at this stage, was no longer overwhelming. It was integrated, present in the background of her thoughts, like a constant, quiet echo. Marcus stood near the doorway, reviewing his schedule tablet briefly, before locking the screen and setting it aside. Another small adjustment, another intentional act of presence. You are preparing earlier than necessary, he observed. She gave a faint, thoughtful smile. I've noticed something about myself. What? It takes more energy to appear emotionally composed in public now. He nodded once. That is consistent with prolonged emotional processing. She glanced at him through the mirror. You always make emotional exhaustion sound clinical. It is my method of understanding complex internal states, he replied calmly. And strangely, that honesty no longer felt distant. It felt grounding. Educational truth. When people are grieving quietly, emotional performance in public spaces becomes significantly more exhausting than usual. She finished adjusting her bracelet and turned slightly. I'm not as fragile as I was the first week, she said. I am aware, but I'm not fully stable either. That is also evident. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just honest. I don't want today to revolve around my grief, she added. It will not, he replied. I don't want people to treat me differently. That is unlikely in professional environments, he said. They will likely respond with increased politeness rather than emotional engagement. She almost smiled. That is very accurate, because sympathy in public spaces often transforms into respectful distance over time. Less direct concern, more professional normalcy. And while that shift is socially appropriate, it can feel emotionally isolating. As they walked toward the car, Elena felt something subtle rising in her chest. Not anxiety, not sadness, something more complex. Awareness. Awareness that Marcus had rearranged his entire day to attend this event with her, without announcing it, without highlighting it, without expecting acknowledgement. You cleared your afternoon, she said quietly, as they stepped outside. Yes, for me, for alignment, he corrected calmly. She looked at him. You're being careful with your wording. I am being precise. Another pause. You don't have to stay the entire time, she said gently. I can manage. He opened the car door for her before responding. I am not attending because you cannot manage, he said. She sat down slowly. Then why? He closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side before answering. Because emotional support is not only necessary during crisis, he said once seated. It is also important during gradual recovery phases. That sentence lingered deeply. Educational insight. Support during quiet healing phases is often more impactful than support during visible crises. The drive to the foundation building was calm, filled with soft silence rather than conversation. And that silence felt different now. Not emotionally distant, emotionally respectful. When they arrived, the building looked exactly as it always did. Polished glass, structured architecture, quiet professionalism. Normal, externally normal, internally layered. As they entered, several familiar faces greeted them politely. Elena, it's good to see you, one coordinator said warmly. Thank you, she replied, her voice steady but gentle. No dramatic sympathy, no intrusive questions, just professional acknowledgement. Exactly as Marcus predicted. And yet, as the conversations continued, Elena noticed something unexpected within herself. She was functioning, engaging, listening, responding, but beneath that functionality, a quiet emotional fatigue was building faster than usual. Public composure required energy, and grief reduced emotional reserves. Educational truth. Grieving individuals often have reduced emotional bandwidth, making social interactions more draining than they appear externally. Midway through the event, during a discussion about new outreach programs, Elena felt her focus drift slightly, not dramatically, just subtly. Words blurred. Conversations softened into background noise. Not because she didn't care, but because emotional processing was still happening beneath the surface. Marcus noticed immediately, not through obvious signals, but through micro-behavioral shifts. You have been quieter for the last 12 minutes, he said softly, when the discussion paused. She blinked slightly. I didn't realize you are mentally present, he continued, but emotionally fatigued. She exhaled slowly. That's exactly how it feels. Not overwhelmed, not distressed, just emotionally tired. And that kind of fatigue is harder to explain because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Would you like to step outside briefly? He asked quietly. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, something deeper surfaced. I don't want to seem fragile, she whispered. His response was immediate, but calm. Emotional pacing is not fragility. She looked at him. You're reframing everything lately. I am recalibrating my interpretations, he replied. That phrase stayed with her longer than expected. Recalibrating, not changing who he was, not becoming someone else, just adjusting how he responded to emotional realities. I'm worried about something, she admitted suddenly. He remained fully attentive. What concern? That my grief will become prolonged, she said softly, and that eventually it will start affecting you. Silence followed. Deep, real, because that fear, the fear of becoming a burden, is one of the most common emotional struggles during grief. I do not perceive your grief as a burden, he said calmly. You don't now, she replied. But what about months from now? Another pause. Measured, thoughtful. You are assuming emotional endurance must have a fixed expiration date, he said. She blinked. That's not what I meant. But it is what you fear, he concluded gently. She looked down at her hands. Yes, educational insight. Many grieving individuals fear that their prolonged healing process will emotionally exhaust their partners. I don't want our relationship to become centered around my emotional recovery, she continued. Our relationship is not centered around your grief, he replied. Then what is it centered around right now? He answered without hesitation. Adaptation. That single word shifted something inside her. Not obligation, not emotional strain. Adaptation. Two people adjusting to a new emotional reality together. Not perfectly, not quickly, but intentionally. And for the first time since the funeral, Elena realized something important. Her healing was not a disruption to their marriage. It was a phase they were learning to navigate together. They stepped outside, onto the quiet terrace beside the foundation hall. The air was cooler than expected, carrying a calm stillness that felt grounding after the structured conversations inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood something important now. Not every emotional moment needed to be filled with words. Elena rested her hands lightly against the railing, her shoulders lowering just slightly, a subtle release of the emotional composure she had maintained indoors. I didn't realize how draining that felt, she admitted quietly. The social engagement? Marcus asked. Yes. Not the conversations themselves, but the effort to stay emotionally steady during them. He nodded once. That aligns with reduced emotional bandwidth during grief processing. She gave him a faint look. You're still translating everything into structured language. It helps me avoid minimizing your experience, he replied calmly. That answer caught her off guard, because beneath the analytical tone was something deeper, intentional care. Educational truth. Some people use structured language not to distance themselves emotionally, but to ensure they take emotions seriously rather than dismiss them. She exhaled slowly, watching the distant movement of people below. I used to be able to attend events like that without thinking twice, she said. And now it requires preparation. Yes, and recovery afterward. She blinked. That's exactly how it feels. Another quiet pause followed, but this one felt safe, grounded, steady, not fragile, not tense, just emotionally honest. I keep worrying about something, she admitted after a moment. Marcus remained still, fully attentive. That my grief is lasting longer than it should. He did not interrupt. That eventually, she continued softly, I'll stop being seen as someone who's grieving and start being seen as someone who's emotionally stuck. Silence settled between them, heavier than before, but not uncomfortable, because that fear was deeply human and rarely spoken out loud. Educational insight. Grieving individuals often fear social and relational timelines more than their actual emotional pain. Marcus considered her words carefully before responding. Grief does not follow socially acceptable timelines, he said. I know that logically, but emotionally, he continued. You are comparing your internal process to external expectations. She looked down slightly. Yes, and that comparison is creating secondary emotional pressure. She gave a small, tired nod. I don't want to become emotionally exhausting, she said quietly. The sentence was soft, controlled, but heavy with meaning. He studied her expression with usual focus. You believe prolonged grief may negatively impact our relationship. She hesitated. Yes, and that belief is causing you to suppress certain emotional expressions. Another pause. Yes, educational truth. Fear of becoming a burden often leads grieving individuals to emotionally self-regulate in ways that delay authentic healing. Marcus stepped slightly closer to the railing, maintaining respectful distance rather than intruding on her space. I do not experience your grief as emotional exhaustion, he said calmly. You don't now, she replied. But what about later? He answered without hesitation this time. My perception of emotional support is not dependent on duration. She blinked slowly. That sounded very deliberate. Whoa. She turned slightly to face him. You're saying my healing timeline doesn't frustrate you. I am saying, he clarified, that emotional recovery is not a performance metric. That sentence settled deeply into the quiet space between them. Not dramatic, not overly comforting, but stabilizing. Educational insight, emotionally mature reassurance, focuses on acceptance rather than rushing resolution. I think, Elena said softly, I've been measuring my grief against how functional I appear. And your functionality has remained high, he observed. Yes, but internal emotional weight persists. Yes, another pause. And that discrepancy is causing internal conflict, he concluded. She let out a quiet breath. You really do notice everything, don't you? I notice pattern, he replied. And lately, she said gently, you've been noticing me more than patterns. That observation lingered because it was true, and both of them knew it. A light breeze passed across the terrace, carrying a subtle sense of calm. I used to think emotional strength meant not needing support, she admitted. And now, I think emotional strength might actually mean allowing support without guilt. He nodded once. That is a psychologically sustainable perspective. She almost smiled. You always validate emotions through logic. It is the most reliable framework I currently possess, he said calmly. And yet, despite the structured language, his presence itself communicated something far more emotional than his words ever did. He stayed consistently, without impatience, without withdrawal, without attempting to accelerate her healing. I noticed something today, she continued softly. What? You didn't interrupt me when I hesitated inside. I observed that you required a pacing adjustment. She let out a small, genuine breath of relief. You're learning emotional pacing. Yes, that matters more than saying the perfect thing. Silence followed again, lighter this time, more grounded, more aligned. I think my biggest fear, she said after a moment, is that one day you'll quietly wish things were back to how they were before the funeral, before the grief, before the emotional recalibration of their marriage. Marcus did not respond immediately, not out of avoidance, out of intention. Before, he said slowly, I operated under the assumption that emotional stability meant emotional minimalism. She studied him carefully. And now I am recognizing that emotional presence does not destabilize structure, he replied. It strengthens relational consistency. That statement held a quiet depth that even surprised her. You're not overwhelmed by my grief, she asked softly. No, you're not waiting for it to end. No. Another pause. Why? She asked. Because that question mattered more than reassurance. It asked for truth, and truth, especially from someone like Marcus, was rarely impulsive. I am not supporting you until your grief ends, he said calmly. I am supporting you while it exists. The simplicity of that sentence shifted something deep inside her chest. Not relief, not sudden peace, but emotional steadiness. Educational truth, healthy support in relationships, is not conditional on emotional timelines. It is consistent through them. She looked away briefly, her eyes resting on the quiet horizon. That's different from how I expected this to be, she admitted. In what way? I thought grief would isolate me emotionally, she said, even within my marriage. And instead, it's revealing parts of our relationship we never fully examined. He nodded once. That is consistent with emotionally significant life events. Another silence followed, but this one felt almost calm. Not empty, not heavy, just present. I don't feel like a burden right now, she said softly. You are not one. I don't feel emotionally alone either. He did not respond verbally this time. He simply remained beside her, steady, present, unhurried. And in that quiet moment on the terrace, Elena realized something she hadn't fully allowed herself to acknowledge. Marcus was not trying to fix her grief. He was adapting to it. Not perfectly, not emotionally, expressively, but consistently. And sometimes, consistency is the most powerful form of love during emotionally uncertain seasons. As they stood there, the noise from inside the building faintly audible in the background, her voice softened once more. I think my healing will be slow, he nodded. That is acceptable. And uneven. That is expected. Time's quiet. That is natural. She looked at him fully now. And you're okay with that? Yes, not dramatic, not emotional in tone, but unwavering. And for the first time since her loss, Elena felt something quietly settle within her. She didn't need to rush her healing to preserve her relationship, because the relationship itself was evolving alongside her healing, not in opposition to it. A month after the funeral, life did not feel lighter. It felt different, not dramatically different, not suddenly peaceful, just subtly reorganized. Grief no longer arrived in sharp waves that stopped her in place. Instead, it appeared in quieter moments, when she reached for her phone in the morning, when she passed the tea shelf her mother used to ask about, when something small happened and her first instinct was still to share it. Then she remembered every time. Elena stood in the kitchen again that morning, but this time, she was not frozen in place. She moved slowly, deliberately, preparing tea without reheating it twice. The sunlight stretched across the marble counter, just as it had weeks ago, yet the emotional weight attached to that space had softened slightly. Not disappeared, softened. Marcus entered shortly after, his presence calm as usual, but now less rigid in his movements, an almost imperceptible shift that only someone emotionally observant would notice. You drank the tea while it was still warm, he observed. She glanced at the mug, then at him, a faint smile touching her lips. That's progress, apparently. He nodded once. It indicates improved behavioral engagement with routine. She shook her head gently. You measure healing in patterns. I measure change in observable adjustments, he replied calmly. Educational truth. Healing after loss rarely appears as emotional breakthroughs. It often shows up as small behavioral shifts in daily routines. She leaned lightly against the counter. I don't cry every day anymore, she admitted. And when you do, it's quieter, she said. Less overwhelming. More reflective. He absorbed that information carefully. That suggests emotional integration rather than suppression. She paused, studying him. You're not trying to fix how I feel anymore. No, and you're not trying to distract me from it either. No. Another pause followed, but this one felt steady rather than heavy. I think something changed after the terrace conversation, she said softly. In what way? I stopped worrying about how long my grief would last. He nodded once. That reduces secondary emotional stress. She almost smiled. You always translate emotional relief into psychological terminology. It ensures accuracy, he replied. And yet, despite the analytical phrasing, the emotional consistency behind his presence was unmistakable. Later that afternoon, Elena found herself doing something she had not done since before the funeral. She opened her mother's old recipe notebook, not out of obligation, not out of forced emotional processing, but out of quiet curiosity. The pages were slightly worn, filled with handwritten notes in familiar ink, small reminders, personal adjustments, little comments in the margins. She traced one of the lines gently with her finger. Too much sugar last time. Adjust. A soft breath escaped her. Not a sob, not a breakdown, just a quiet emotional acknowledgement. Marcus noticed from the doorway, but did not interrupt. He observed first, then approached slowly, maintaining the respectful emotional distance he had learned was important. You have not opened that notebook since the funeral, he said. No, and today you chose to. Yes, why today? She thought for a moment before answering, because it didn't feel unbearable to look at it. That answer carried quiet significance. Educational insight, emotional healing often begins when memories shift from being overwhelmingly painful to gently meaningful. I used to think opening this would make the grief worse, she continued. Oh, now it just makes me miss her. He remained silent, not because he lacked words, but because he understood now that missing someone was not a problem to solve. It was an experience to allow. I'm not avoiding memories anymore, she added softly. That indicates emotional processing rather than emotional evasion. She closed the notebook gently. I think I was afraid that moving forward meant forgetting. He responded without hesitation. Memory retention and emotional progression are not mutually exclusive. She looked at him. That's a very structured way to say something emotionally reassuring. It is factually accurate, he replied. Another small silence passed between them, but this one carried warmth rather than heaviness. Have you noticed something important? The grief was still present. The loss was still real, but the emotional atmosphere between them had shifted from tension to understanding. And that shift did not happen through dramatic apologies or emotional speeches. It happened through consistency, through presence, through gradual emotional alignment. That evening, as they sat in the living room, the television on low volume and the lights dimmed softly, Elena noticed something subtle about Marcus. He was not working, not checking emails, not reviewing reports, just sitting, present. You've been home earlier every day this week, she said. Yes, intentionally? Yes. Why didn't you mention it? He considered, briefly, because consistent behavioral support is more effective than verbal declarations. She blinked slowly. That might be the most emotionally aware thing you've said in our entire marriage. He did not smile, but the tension in his posture eased slightly. I am adapting, he said simply. She leaned back slightly, her voice softer now. I used to think love meant understanding each other instantly. And now I think it means being willing to understand each other gradually. He nodded once. That a sustainable relational model. Silence followed again, but now silence no longer felt like emotional distance. It felt like emotional safety. I still have moments, she admitted. Moments where the grief feels unexpectedly heavy. That is consistent with non-linear emotional recovery. And sometimes, she continued, I feel guilty when I have a normal day. He turned his attention fully toward her. Guilty in what sense? Like moving forward means leaving her behind. He paused longer this time, because this was not about behavioral patterns. This about emotional meaning. Continuing life functions does not equate to emotional abandonment, he said carefully. She exhaled slowly. I know that logically, but emotionally, it feels like disloyalty. Yes, educational truth. Many grieving individuals experience guilt when their life begins to feel normal again. He leaned slightly forward. Your grief coexists with your daily life, he said, does not require emotional stagnation as proof of love. That sentence settled deeply into the quiet room. Not dramatic, not overly comforting, but stabilizing. She looked at him carefully. You're speaking differently now. In what way? Less like someone analyzing grief, and more like someone who understands its emotional context. He did not deny it. I am learning through observation and experience. Another pause? You didn't understand grief emotionally before, she said gently. No, and now I understand that emotional presence is more effective than emotional correction. That admission carried more emotional growth than any apology could have. She leaned her head back, slightly against the couch, her voice quiet, but steady. I'm not healed, she said. I am where I'm not the same as I was before. That is expected, but I'm also not as emotionally fragile as I was in the first week. That indicates adaptive, emotional resilience. For the first time that evening, she smiled. Not out of forced optimism, but out of genuine recognition. Recognition of growth, recognition of effort, recognition of a relationship that had quietly evolved during one of the most emotionally difficult periods of her life. And in that quiet living room, surrounded by ordinary stillness, Elena realized something deeply important. Healing had not happened in a dramatic moment. It had happened slowly, in conversations, in silences, in small decisions, in consistent presence, and, perhaps most importantly, in the realization that love did not require fixing grief, only staying beside it while it softened on its own. There was no single moment when Elena woke up and felt healed. No dramatic morning where the grief was suddenly lighter. No sudden realization that everything was okay again. No emotional breakthrough that erased the weight of loss. Instead, change arrived quietly, so quietly that she almost missed it. It showed up in ordinary moments, in drinking her tea while it was still warm, in opening her mother's notebook without feeling overwhelmed, in walking through the house without pausing at every memory, not because she missed her mother less, but because the grief had begun to coexist with her life instead of interrupting it. And that distinction mattered more than she had expected. One evening, nearly 6 weeks after the funeral, Elena found herself standing on the same balcony where she had first stepped away during the promotion party. The city lights stretched endlessly below, unchanged, indifferent to personal loss and emotional evolution. Yet she felt different. Not lighter, not happier, just steadier. Marcus stepped onto the balcony a few moments later, as he often did now, not to initiate conversation, not to analyze, but simply to be present in the same space. You return here frequently, he observed. Yes, for reflection, for breathing, she replied softly. He nodded once, accepting the distinction. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed over the past weeks. It was no longer filled with misunderstanding. It was filled with comfort. And that, in many ways, was the quietest form of emotional growth. I was thinking about the night of the party, she said, finally. He remained still, attentive. I remember how angry I felt, she continued. Not loudly angry, just quietly hurt. That response was justified, he said calmly. And I remember thinking, she added, he doesn't understand what I'm going through. He did not interrupt, because now he understood that some reflections were not accusations. They were acknowledgments. I was right, she said gently. You didn't understand. Yes, he admitted, without hesitation. Another soft pause. But you also weren't heartless, she continued. He looked at her briefly. You were structured, conditioned, efficient, trying to help the only way you knew how. Silence settled again. But it was not heavy. It was honest. Educational truth, misunderstanding in relationships, is often rooted in different emotional conditioning, not lack of love. I thought keeping you busy would protect you from grief, he said. And now I understand that grief requires emotional space, not structured distraction. She leaned slightly against the railing. That realization changed how I saw you, she admitted. In what way? I stopped seeing you as emotionally distant, she said softly, and started seeing you as emotionally untrained. That sentence could have sounded critical, but it didn't. It sounded compassionate. And compassion, especially in long-term relationships, creates emotional safety where defensiveness once lived. That is an accurate assessment, he replied calmly. She let out a quiet breath. You didn't suddenly become emotionally expressive, she continued. You didn't give dramatic speeches. You didn't try to fix my grief. No, you just stayed. Yes. The simplicity of that exchange carried more emotional weight than any dramatic declaration of love ever could, because consistency had become his language of care. Educational insight. Sustainable love is not built on grand emotional gestures, but on consistent presence during difficult emotional seasons. I think I misunderstood something about love, Elena said after a moment. What? I used to think loving someone meant understanding their emotions instantly. He listened without interruption. But now, she continued, I think loving someone means being willing to learn their emotions gradually. He nodded once. That a more realistic relational model. She smiled faintly. You're still analytical. Yes, but you're also more emotionally aware now. Yes. Another silence followed. Soft, grounded, peaceful, not because grief was gone, but because emotional tension was no longer present. I don't feel alone in my grief anymore, she admitted quietly. I am aware, and you didn't achieve that by fixing how I felt. No, you achieved it by adjusting how you responded. Yes, that word, adjusted, held the essence of everything that had changed between them. Not transformation, not perfection. Adjustment, gradual, intentional, realistic. She turned slightly to face him. I'm still angry sometimes, she confessed gently, at the situation, at the loss, at how quickly life moved forward. That is a normal emotional response. But I'm not angry at you anymore, she added. He did not respond immediately, because that statement carried meaning far deeper than it appeared on the surface. Why? He asked, finally. Because you listened when it mattered, she said, and you changed your behavior instead of defending your intentions. Educational truth. In emotionally mature relationships, behavioral accountability is more impactful than verbal justification. The city lights flickered softly in the distance. Time moved. Life continued. Grief remained. Quieter now, but still present in subtle ways. My mom used to say something, Elena murmured. He turned his attention fully toward her. She used to say that the strongest relationships aren't the ones without emotional differences. She paused, but the ones where both people are patient enough to understand those differences over time. Silence followed. Longer this time, but deeply calm. I believe that statement is accurate, Marcus said. She looked at him carefully. You didn't try to become someone else for me, she said. You didn't suddenly turn emotional or dramatic. No, you remained structured, observant, consistent. Yes, but you also became present in ways you weren't before. He considered that. That was an intentional adjustment. She smiled softly, and I didn't rush my healing just to make things easier for the relationship. No, you allowed your grief to exist naturally. Yes, another quiet pause passed between them. I think that's why this worked, she said gently. In what sense? Because neither of us tried to fix the other. He absorbed that slowly. You did not attempt to accelerate your healing to meet my emotional pace, he said, and you didn't force emotional solutions onto my grief. Yes, that balance, imperfect but intentional, had quietly reshaped their marriage. Not into something dramatic, not into something idealized, but into something more emotionally sustainable. I'm not the same person I was before my mom died, she said softly. That is expected. But I'm also not broken. No, and our relationship isn't damaged. No, he paused briefly before adding something he had never said before. It has evolved. That word settled deeply into the moment. Evolved. Not strained. Not fractured. Not weakened. Evolved. Elena leaned back slightly, her voice calm and grounded. I still miss her every day. That will likely continue. But the grief doesn't control my entire day anymore. That indicates emotional integration. She smiled faintly. You always end emotional conversations with psychological clarity. It provides structure to complex experiences. And for the first time since the beginning of this journey, Elena laughed softly, not out of relief, not out of distraction, but out of genuine emotional steadiness. A quiet, grounded laugh. I think this is what real love looks like, she said finally. Define real in this context. She met his gaze, not fixing each other, not rushing each other, not expecting perfect emotional alignment. She paused gently, but staying, adjusting, learning, and growing, even when the emotional timeline is uneven. He nodded once. That is a sustainable definition. And there, on the same balcony where emotional tension once lived, something subtle but powerful had fully settled between them. Not a perfect ending, not a dramatic reconciliation, not the disappearance of grief, but something far more realistic. A healthier emotional pattern, a deeper mutual understanding, a love that did not demand emotional perfection, only emotional patience. And for the first time since the funeral, Elena no longer felt like she was enduring her grief inside a relationship that didn't understand it. She felt like she was healing within a relationship that had learned how to hold space for it, not by fixing her pain, but by staying beside her, while she slowly learned how to live with it. If this chapter resonated with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more realistic love stories that carry deep life lessons about marriage, grief, and emotional growth. Tell me in the comments, do you believe real love is about fixing your partner, or learning how to stay with them through their emotional seasons? Because the biggest lesson from this story is simple but powerful. Healthy love doesn't rush healing, doesn't force emotions, and doesn't demand perfection. It grows through patience, understanding, and consistent presence. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that love is not about being emotionally perfect. It's about being emotionally present.